Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
There's just 3 days to go before the election, and the terror attack has sparked off heated arguments about security policy. The Prime Minister has been defending her record on counter-terrorism and policing. That's after the Labour leader backed calls for Theresa May to resign for cuts to the number of police officers while she was Home Secretary. But Theresa May said the Metropolitan Police was well-resourced and accused Jeremy Corbyn of failing to support measures to tackle terrorism. Laura Koonsberg now reports on the political reaction.
Raising the stakes, but is she raising her game? Theresa May calls for a new attitude in a new era of terrorist threats. She hopes leadership is her strength, but experience haunts her too.
Because of the changing nature of the threat we face, we need to review our counter-terrorism strategy to make sure the police and security services have all the powers they need. If that means increasing the length of custodial sentences for terrorism-related offences, even apparently less serious offences, that is what we will do. They may be uncomfortable for some to contemplate, but nothing is more important than keeping our country safe.
She's promised tighter rules for internet providers and a review of counter-terror too. But again and again, she was pressed on falling police budgets and falling numbers too.
On your watch as Home Secretary, the number of armed police officers fell. It's still lower than it was in 2010. The number of officers fell in total by 20,000, as we've been hearing. And also control orders that monitored terrorists were watered down. Would it not be leadership to say that you would reverse those cuts?
We have enhanced the powers for the police. We've ensured that the security and intelligence agencies have the powers that they need. But it's not just about resource, it's about the powers people have.
The independent former terror watchdog agreed.
Do you think that police cuts and a squeeze on the Home Office budget has made a difference?
I think that this is a completely misleading argument, and the Prime Minister is right about it. The cuts in community policing are a legitimate issue to raise in the election, but they're nothing to do with terrorism.
Plenty disagree, and for Labour, attacking the police cuts is the best form of political defence.
We're not going to allow anybody to dictate how we live our lives or how we go about enjoying ourselves.
Jeremy Corbyn's application for the biggest job in the land is to restore cuts to public services.
Will you take me on as an apprentice in your company?
Well, I'd have to see your grades first.
Having seemed to call for Theresa May to resign before clarifying, Jeremy Corbyn says he'd consider any request from the security services for more power.
One is more police, that's absolutely essential. Secondly, more intelligence on the operations that are necessary to prevent a terror attack taking place, and so the reports that are going to have to be looked at. And also, the Home Office should release its report on funding of terrorist organisations, which it's been sitting on and not released for a very long time.
Despite the usual energetic photocalls, the weekend's attacks have refocused this campaign.
There must be a determination across all of the parties to challenge robustly extremism in all of its forms. But as we do that, we've got to make sure we pull people together.
OK, right, let's do it then.
In coalition, the Lib Dems were reluctant to tighten some terror laws.
Theresa May, who has made a choice to give away corporation tax cuts to very wealthy corporations and at the same time to cut funding for the police.
With the choice just days away, the discussions are nearly done. But the closing phase of this campaign is a fundamentally different shape to when it all began. And the question on the table now, the most basic of all, who will you trust to keep the country safe?
The Tories hope the Prime Minister's experience will land her back in power. Her record could trip her up too. Laura Koonsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So, as we've just heard, there's been claim and counterclaim from politicians on the campaign trail today about police and security. So what do those on the front line feel they need? More resources or more powers? Our correspondent Gordon Carrera has been looking at the arguments around the security response to the terror threat.
The aftermath of the third attack in 3 months. with questions about what can be done to stop more. Today, the political row was all about police numbers. The total number of police in England and Wales did fall 13% from 2009 to 2016. The number of firearms officers fell by 18%, or more than 1,000 over the same period. But last year, more money was announced to bring it back to its peak of 7,000. Firearms officers are important in responding to an attack, but stopping them in the first place may require a different debate. Police and MI5 say they're dealing with a threat which is different to what's been seen before in scale and nature. At the moment, there are 500 live counter-terrorist investigations. These involve 3,000 people suspected of involvement in terrorism. But crucially, there are another 20,000 people who've previously been subjects of interest. And recently, it's been those people who've turned to violence, sometimes with little warning. A major challenge for police and MI5 is spotting if any of these individuals suddenly move towards planning an attack. So, does a new threat require a new approach? It may require more resources in some areas. It takes dozens of trained specialist surveillance officers to follow someone round the clock. But it also might require new ways of working, with security services needing to go back over old cases to more systematically review if an individual's threat profile has changed, and making sure tip-offs that come in on the anti-terrorist hotline are properly examined. But will it also require extra powers? Some politicians have talked about new forms of detention without charge, a beefed-up version of the control orders which used to operate. Others have called for more specific measures, like limiting people's ability to buy phones or communicate anonymously. Police and MI5 have not called for new powers yet, but they recognise they will need to adapt to keep pace with the terrorist threat, and this will take more than just numbers. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
Theresa May was forced to defend her record over police funding cuts today. She insisted the government has given extra money for more armed police and protected counter-terror budgets. But the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said there was deep anger over the fall in numbers and supported calls for Mrs May to resign. Our political correspondent Libby Vina now on the row over police cuts.
Who could doubt their bravery and the speed with which they reacted to the London Bridge attack? But have police cuts taken a toll and made us less safe than we might have been? The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn claims they have, telling ITV News he backed calls for Theresa May to resign.
There's been calls made by a lot of very responsible people on this who are very worried that she was at the Home Office for all this time, presided over these cuts in police numbers, and now is saying that we have a problem. Yes, we do have a problem. We shouldn't have cut the police numbers.
So to be clear, you would like to resign over this?
We've got an election on Thursday, and that's perhaps the best opportunity to deal with it.
In 2010, there were nearly 6,800 firearms officers in England and Wales. By 2016, that number had dropped to less than 5,700, meaning there were 1,100 fewer armed officers on our streets. Theresa May insisted today that since 2015, police budgets had been protected. But questioned as to whether cuts made earlier should be reversed, she pointedly refused to say, instead going on the offensive, attacking Jeremy Corbyn's record on security matters, saying he wasn't fit to be Prime Minister.
I've been responsible for giving the police extra powers to deal with terrorism. Jeremy Corbyn has boasted that he has opposed those powers and opposed the powers for anti-terror actions throughout his time in Parliament. And I also support absolutely shoot to kill. And I think what we saw on our streets on Saturday was how important that was.
But what about the police themselves? Looking forward, it seems they believe more money and more people are needed.
In 9 weeks, 3 attacks, 5 foiled plots. That is a very high tempo of work, it's very high intensity, it's very demanding for us. And we do need to work with the government to see what policing needs, what the agencies need.
Extra security for pedestrians is already in place on Westminster Bridge, and security now looks set to dominate the remaining days of the election campaign. Libby Vina, ITV News, Westminster.
Well, with security practically the only issue on the political agenda, Jeremy Corbyn has urged voters to throw out Theresa May on Thursday over her record on police funding, saying there was deep anger that 20,000 officers had lost their jobs. Mrs May refused to say whether she would reverse the cuts, instead accusing the Labour leader of failing to support anti-terrorism measures. But could this election be turning into a choice over who will best keep the public safe? Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this report.
Westminster Bridge had new protections put in place overnight for pedestrians. Just down the road, Theresa May was trying to get normal electioneering fully restarted. She suggested that the surge in terrorist activity only added to the arguments for the country to pick her on Thursday.
If ever there was a time for a Prime Minister who is ready and able to do the job from day one, this is it. Because there's no time for learning on the job.
Theresa May was trying to bring the election back to the lines on leadership and Brexit, which she'd once hoped would dominate everything. But Saturday's attack has thrown attention onto her record as Home Secretary and the cut in police numbers she delivered. The Met Chief, side by side with the Mayor of London, today suggested the police might need more people now.
All of us, and I think the Prime Minister said this yesterday, all of us need to look at the overall strategy, the tactics, the resourcing.
This morning, Cressida Dick said that in the light of the attack over the weekend, absolutely we need to look at having more police, more forensics, more intelligence officers. Do you agree? And would that mean you were wrong to cut numbers?
We have protected counter-terrorism policing budgets. We've funded an uplift in the number of armed police officers. And from 2015, as I said in my speech, we're protecting police budgets.
Theresa May spoke of the need to take on extremism earlier in the community, in what sounded a lot like the argument she opposed when her former cabinet colleague Michael Gove pushed it in government. From across the Atlantic, there was another intervention from the US president. Yesterday, President Trump tweeted, "At least 7 dead and 48 wounded in terror attack," and the Mayor of London says there is no reason to be alarmed. Sadiq Khan had advised Londoners not to be alarmed by additional police activity in London after the attacks. The Mayor's office said Mr Khan had more important things to do than respond to the President's ill-informed tweet. Today, President Trump snapped back, pathetic excuse by London Mayor Sadiq Khan, who had to think fast on his no reason to be alarmed statement. Mainstream media's working hard to sell it.
Thank you all very much.
Mr Khan heavily hinted he didn't think President Trump's state visit this year was a good idea. His party leader resumed full campaigning at rallies in Labour strongholds across the northeast of England. He said his message against cuts, including police cuts, could deliver a big surprise on Thursday.
This election is about a choice of the kind of society and kind of world we want to live in. Ours, based on the values of us, of communities, of people coming together. Ours, based on those Labour traditions of the National Health Service, of education, of intervention in industry to make sure there are jobs and services and investment for the future. Or the Tory way of tax cuts at the top and cuts at the bottom. I know what choice I've made. I know what choice our manifesto has made. And in the remaining days, we've got a wet Monday, a dry Tuesday, a middling Wednesday, but we've got a very, very sunny Thursday coming up.
Well, now Gary is in Westminster and Michael Crick is in County Durham, where earlier he caught up with Jeremy Corbyn. But first to Gary, is what we've heard today going to be, and indeed seen today, going to be the shape of the final few days of this campaign, Gary?
It does look like it, barring the unexpected. Security is bound to be woven into both the two main leaders' campaigns. Theresa May saying words to the effect, now's not the time for a novice, and Jeremy Corbyn weaving his theme about cuts, and in particular police cuts, into his campaign. Theresa May obviously will be trying to get the campaign back onto her key themes of leadership and Brexit. Interestingly today, though, as well, she had quite a section of her speech devoted to the economy. And in Labour circles, you find they think that's kind of the dog that didn't bark in this campaign. When Tories win campaigns, it's normally because they blasted the issue of the economy at Labour, and they haven't really done that here. So you do wonder very slightly if there was a little bit of campaigners' remorse going on in Theresa May bringing that up late in the campaign. For Jeremy Corbyn, He's going to be back on his issues about the public services, rebalancing the economy, but he's going to be doing it very interestingly in the setting of mass-attended, thousands of people, mass-attended rallies. And he thinks, they went out of fashion a bit in British politics, he thinks they'll convince voters, he hopes they will, that this is a moment, and a moment that can be seized.
Well, now, Michael is in County Durham. Thank you, Gary. Michael, is Mr Corbyn, with whom you've been talking today, is he on the defensive when it comes to his own record on anti-terror legislation?
Well, up to a point, but Labour think that they are very much on the offensive when it comes to this issue, in that they are promising an extra 10,000 police officers, as Gary reported there, and they're suggesting that Theresa May, in her time as Home Secretary, is partly responsible for what happened at London Bridge and what happened in Manchester. But in terms of his actual campaign today here in the North East, Jeremy Corbyn seems to have been very much on the defensive. He's visited a string of 4 Labour seats up here, 3 of which you could say are solid Labour, including this one here, North West Durham, which is a majority of more than 10,000, and where I caught up with Mr Corbyn earlier today and asked him both about terrorism and his itinerary.
Mr Corbyn.
Hello, Michael, how are you?
Very well, thank you. We know about your pledge on police numbers, but isn't it time to consider some curtailment of civil liberties, particularly over some things like surveillance and detention?
No, I think what we need is more police numbers and more intelligence-led policing as well, but we have to maintain our liberties, we have to maintain... Can I finish, Michael? Finish? Yeah? We have to maintain our independence of our judicial system and judicial oversight of what all public authorities do. I think it's quite an important principle.
All civil liberties? You wouldn't perhaps have slightly more surveillance powers or detention powers?
Michael, everything that's done has to be judicially sound, and that has been concerns about some previous anti-terror legislation. And it means we have to have robust and strong policing, but it has to be fair and it has to be judicially correct.
What are you doing in concert? Labour majority, more than 10,000. You're off to Blythe, 9,000. Gateshead, nearly 15,000. What are you doing in these rock-solid Labour seats? Doesn't it show you're on the run?
No,
it's more about trying to shore up your leadership than to become Prime Minister.
Michael, that is a totally absurd question.
What are you doing on all these rock-solid Labour seats?
Even by your standards, that's an absurd question. There are thousands of students who come to this college. And do you know what? They don't all live in concert. They live all over the place. And I'm talking to them, and I'm listening to them, and I'm getting inspiration and ideas from them. And do you know what? You'll see something very interesting on Thursday. Just hold your patience, and you'll see a result.
Michael Crick speaking to Jeremy Corbyn earlier. Well, the attacks have sparked a fresh debate, not just about police numbers, but also whether more officers should routinely carry guns. Met Commissioner Cressida Dick said she didn't think that was a sensible response, but said she would be seeking more resourcing for London's force. So are there enough officers on the streets to deal with the rising threat? Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel reports.
Can a bobby on the beat crack a terror cell? Probably not on my own.
This was a Police Federation video supported by counter-terrorism chiefs produced last year.
So are you. A little bit of information is often where it all begins. A concerned neighbour.
It was aimed at promoting the role of neighbourhood policing as the government cuts began to bite. The reality of the weekend's terror attack has reignited that issue, with growing concern that crucial information on the ground is no longer being picked up.
Counter-terrorism hotlines are great, and please, if anybody has any information, use them. However, the eyes and ears for communities and for the police is within communities. By withdrawing neighbourhood officers from communities, you're withdrawing the eyes and ears. They are the ones that have the conversations with the youth, the elderly, the shopkeepers, the nurses, the doctors in their communities. That's where intelligence comes from.
The question is whether it is simply about numbers. From a record high in 2009, police numbers in England and Wales have dropped by more than 20,000. And in almost the same period, the number of firearms officers has fallen by around 500. And the only comparable figures available show that neighbourhood officers fell by 3,000 between 2015 and 2016. Theresa May, 2 years ago when Home Secretary, stated at the Police Federation conference that the country had never been safer.
The truth is that crime fell in each of those years. It's fallen further since, and our country is safer than it has ever been. So please, for your sake, and for the thousands of police officers who work so hard every day, this crying wolf has to stop.
Theresa May's justification for cuts was twofold. One, crime was falling, and two, there was no direct link between the number of officers and levels of crime. But the weekend's terror attack, the third in 10 weeks, has prompted some to believe that maybe it's not that simple, even if counter-terrorism budgets have been protected. London's mayor today, visiting the site of the attack, outlined the scale of cuts to the budget of the country's largest police force.
It's just a fact that over the last 7 years, we as a city have lost £600 million from our budget. We have had to close police stations, sell police buildings. We've lost thousands of police staff.
But the recent attacks have exposed more than just resource issues. The National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism said tonight the situation has become completely different to what's come before and will require a significantly different strategy.
Simon Israel reporting. Will join us now is Michael Gove, the former Justice Secretary, via FaceTime from his Surrey Heath constituency. Michael Gove, now this chap, Butt, appeared on television in a Channel 4 documentary. He said some relatively inflammatory things, was seen with an ISIS-style flag. MI5 know about him, but never knew that he was going to do anything like he did last night. Does this illustrate the point you seem to have been making in Cabinet? You needed more security resources rather than cutting them.
No, I think there are two things I need to say there. The first is that I believe that the resources that we have allocated to dealing with this security threat are right and proportionate. I've never disagreed with that view. But more broadly, on your point about the nature of the threat we face, as has been made clear, it is a significant threat. Up to 23,000 people who have been radicalised or share this ideology of hate. And one of the things that we need to do is to make sure not just that we fund the police appropriately, but we deal with this ideological challenge head on. And that's why what the Prime Minister said yesterday was so important, because she specified and named Islamism, the ideology behind these attacks, as the heart of the threat that we face. And there's a stark contrast between the Prime Minister's clarity, moral clarity in facing this challenge, and what we have from the Labour Party, because let's be clear, Jeremy Corbyn, who could be Prime Minister in 4 days' time, have called the Islamist terrorists of Hamas and Hezbollah friends.
Well, let's talk about what... No, let's for a moment concentrate on the record. And the record speaks of a slash in police numbers. Half the number of armed police. Ordinary police down 20,000 over 15 years. And you are reported to have said enough's enough. But oh no, it seems that you think it was perfectly okay to go on slashing security at a moment when ISIS was rampant across the Middle East.
Well, I think that's a complete mischaracterization of the truth, John. The fact is that counter-terrorism policing, as Simon Israel pointed out in his report, has been protected. The fact is that spending on intelligence and security has been enhanced. The fact is that the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police has said that she has the resources that she needs in order to do the job. And of course, if she needs more resources, then the Prime Minister, if it's Theresa May, will still be there in order to supply them. There's a huge choice at this election between a Prime Minister who has experience at the front line in taking on extremism, and I've seen her close up, resolute in dealing with this threat, or a Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, who can't even tell us what it costs to hire a policeman, never mind command any operational confidence, and a potential Prime Minister...
Mr. Gove, we're pressed because your audio is unfortunately very difficult to listen to. It's very difficult to hear. It's very difficult to hear your audio, so a very, very brief answer to this. Is it therefore a lie that police numbers were cut by 20,000, that armed police were cut by 1,500? Is that a lie?
No, it's not. But it's also important to point out that the amount of money spent on counter-terrorism policing has been protected. It's also important to point out that police spending under the coalition, yes, was cut, but under a majority Conservative government, police spending has been protected in real terms. And it's also critically important to point out that spending on intelligence and security is greater, but even more than spending, even more than resources, there needs to be a willingness to use them. And Jeremy Corbyn would not back the shoot-to-kill policy that is needed to keep...
Mr Gove, we must leave it there, I'm afraid. The technology doesn't quite live up to expectation. Thank you very much for joining us. Diane Abbott, Shadow Home Secretary, now joins us from central London. Diane Abbott, let's just be quite clear about this. You and Jeremy Corbyn appear to have been on a journey. You started out on this campaign more or less anti-Trident, although tolerating its continued development. And you've now passed through an extraordinary pain barrier, which has you backing shoot to kill, and indeed calling for more armed police. This is not the old Labour Home Secretary we knew of old, or Shadow Home Secretary.
I'm here on the fields outside City Hall, having just attended the vigil, and it was a very moving occasion, and I think the people of this country, the people of London, want to give their support and sympathy to the injured and sadly to the tragic victims. On the question of my position or the Labour Party's position on shoot to kill, it's always been the position that we believe the police can use maximum force where people's lives are threatened. And there was no question on Saturday night in Borough Market that people's lives were threatened. And so of course you had to use maximum force.
Well, do you accept that foreign policy does play a part in what goes on the terror front here in Britain?
Well, as you will know, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Eliza Manningham-Bullock, a former head of MI5, have been quite clear that the war in Iraq, to name but one, actually made us more vulnerable to terrorism.
Right, well, let me therefore follow that point up by asking you whether in power you would confront Saudi Arabia and instead of supplying endless weapons for the bombing of Yemen, will perhaps now ask them to take the Wahhabi extremists who are fueling this fire out of circulation.
We've been very clear that we shouldn't let the question of arms sales to Saudi Arabia stop us from standing up to Saudi Arabia, whether they're involved in humanitarian outrages in Yemen or, as seems to be the case, whether they might be funding jihadism in this country. We're very clear on that. Jeremy's been clear on that from the beginning.
So the Saudis go to bed tonight knowing you will confront them full on and threaten to stop all arms sales if they don't sort out the Wahhabis.
We want to review arms sales, partly because of what's happening in the Yemen and partly because of this report, which for some reason government won't publish, about the funding of jihadism in this country.
OK, well, that's fine. You're going to stick with the review, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you, Diane Abbott.
Crowds of people have been observing a moment of silence at a public vigil near London's City Hall to remember the victims, led by the city's mayor, Sadiq Khan. In the last few moments, the White House said President Trump wasn't picking a fight with Mr. Khan. Well, the mayor joins us now live. I'll return to the US president's comments in a minute, but first, our top story tonight. Khurram Bhatt was on national TV on Channel 4 last year, unfurling a sort of ISIS-style flag. Do you feel let down by the security services?
Well, I mean, the police and security services are still engaged in the investigation. I'm sure they'll be asking questions about this. We'll find out what happened. What I will say is this, that actually, if we're going to defeat terrorism, if we're going to stop further attacks happening, all of us, the police, the security services, the emergency services, the public, has to work together to provide them with the intelligence they need. But of course, they need to act on that intelligence and make sure people who are thinking about committing acts of terror, people who are violent extremists, are dealt with by the law.
And you're saying that the police aren't getting the resources that they need. Is the logical consequence of that that London isn't as safe as it should be?
I've been saying now for the last 13 months, ever since I first became the mayor, that we simply don't have the resources we need to provide the best police service we can. The police work their socks off. We saw that on Saturday night. But over the last 7 years, it is a fact that the Met Police has lost £600 million from our budget. And it's also a fact that that means thousands of police staff have been lost, police stations have closed down, police buildings sold off. But the Tory party have plans to make a further £400 million cuts over the next 3-4 years. On top of that, to change the police funding formula, which could mean us losing up to £700 million. That's £1.7 billion since 2010.
Okay,
and
I mean,
it's not rocket science. If there's less and less money, it means we can do less and less.
So, I mean, I should say Theresa May says that since 2015 the police have been protected, the police budget. But are you saying then that she is personally responsible for London being less safe now than it was a few years back?
No, London is the safest global city in the world. London is a safe city. The threat level across the country has been severe for a while now, but the police work incredibly hard with the emergency services and others to keep our city safe. But it's also true when I speak to experts that one of the things the intelligence services rely upon is information from the community. And the best way to give the public confidence to provide information to the police is to have more police officers in the community to restore neighbourhood policing. And that's why I've been arguing over the last 12 months for us to not have any further cuts from the Met Police budget, but actually for us to have additional resources, because as a capital city, our needs are far greater than other parts of the country.
But you say London is the safest city in the world, but you're also saying that the cuts are having a devastating effect. I mean, both of those things can't be true, can they?
Well, we're the safest global city in the world, but there comes a point where the only thing you can cut is the bone. There's nothing more you can cut. Our strategic target of 32,000 officers is there, but we need help from the government, no more cuts, to make sure we can provide the right number of officers that we need. When I first became the mayor, I approved 600 additional armed officers because I accepted that we need to have more armed officers to keep our city safe. But the reality is we can't take any more. The government's plans to cut a further £400 million is not sustainable. If the government changes the police funding formula and cuts a further £700 million, it's not sustainable. And the obvious things we can cut now is police officers.
You've obviously, you're putting Theresa May under severe pressure on that. You've come under quite some pressure from the US president. What do you think that he's got against you?
Well, look, I mean, since Saturday I've been working with the police, with the emergency services, with the government and others to deal with the horrific attack on Saturday. I just haven't got the time to respond to tweets from Donald Trump.
Would you like the state visit to be called off?
Well, my position remains the same. You know, I don't think we should be rolling out the red carpet to the President of the USA in the circumstances where his policies go against everything we stand for. I think one of the things when you have a special relationship, it's no different to when you've got a close mate. You stand with them in times of adversity, but you call them out when they're wrong. And there are many things about which Donald Trump is wrong.
Sadiq Khan, thank you very much for joining us. Now, just days before the election, Theresa May has made a campaign visit to Edinburgh, declaring herself a passionate unionist. The Conservatives hope to capture seats on Thursday, but the SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, thinks her party could deny Mrs May a Westminster majority. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, reports.
100 or so party activists invited by email to a private warehouse outside Edinburgh, taking the message to the streets, this isn't. Location, a business dedicated to people moving house or office.
A household removal warehouse, would you believe? Not exactly a PR dream, just days before the general election for a Prime Minister who may herself have to move. Nevertheless, the slogans to the party faithful were very much what they wanted to hear. But key amongst them, Brexit talks start in just 11 days after the polls close, and she must be the person, she said, to lead them.
The Prime Minister's opening theme, the London Bridge outrage, showed a UK-wide response, and that's why the union must remain.
As Ruth has said, in this week of all weeks, we stand together England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as one united kingdom.
Prime Minister, the SNP have made it very clear that they are campaigning for an independence referendum only after Brexit is finalised. So why are the Conservatives campaigning across Scotland as if there's going to be one tomorrow?
I've been very clear, we've all been very clear. Now is not the time to be talking about a second independence referendum, because we've got a task together which we need to pull together in order to be able to deliver on the Brexit negotiations, not try and drive these four nations apart, which is what Nicola Sturgeon is trying to do.
Warm-up act today, Scottish Tory leader Ruth Davidson, normally sure-footed, but today she went all Donald Trump.
Scottish Conservative MPs aren't going to the House of Commons to try and rip Scotland out of Britain. We're there to try and make Britain great again.
That soon went beyond the warehouse, Scottish Labour press releasing within the hour, calling it a toe-curling moment. Strong and stable. Scotland, of course, doesn't lack for symbols of that. The Liberal Democrat leader was also in Edinburgh today, insisting that the Conservatives and their leader are neither of those.
There we go. Not too dreadful, not too shabby.
Frying up the butties in Edinburgh West this morning, Tim Farron.
Egg butty? I'll take that as a yes.
On Thursday, Theresa May expects a huge landslide, and she will listen to that landslide if she gets it and take that as permission to make more police cuts, to bring in the dementia tax and to cut our schools.
Hopping around Scotland on the Nickelopter, First Minister also lambasted Theresa May for police cuts.
The Tory arrogance in this campaign is starting to turn a lot of people off, as is the prospect of another 5 years of Tory government with more cuts to public services and more people driven into poverty. So on Thursday we've got a chance to make a positive statement about the kind of country we want to be and send strong voices to Westminster to stand up for Scotland's interest.
But the SNP know they're facing every other party lining up telling Scots the SNP equals a second independence referendum, whatever the reality may be. They know they have a fight on their hands. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, Edinburgh.